Hello, my name is Adam Turner and welcome to the Color Trails Technique tutorial. We're going to be talking about rear or second curtain flash sync, and that's going to allow us to balance two exposures between ambient light, or our color trails, and the light from a flash, which is going to be our subject. Now, before we get too deep into it, we need to understand the basic concept of color. What is it? Well, the dictionary says that color is the quality of an object or substance with respect to light reflected back by the object, usually determined visually by a measurement of hue, saturation, and brightness of the reflected light. Simply put, color is just a light that's reflected back from our subject. So how do we capture color in motion? Well, we first have to properly expose the ambient light, or our subject, at rest. As our subject travels through time and space, we can record the reflected light, or the color, by slowing down our shutter speed and allowing a sufficient depth of field to ensure sharpness throughout its travel. Now that we've properly exposed the ambient light, we now have to properly expose our subject by introducing flash. Flash allows us to expose, freeze, and define our subject at a specific point in time and separate it from the color trail. With the introduction of flash, we now have to balance two exposures, which we'll see later in a live video is the experimental part of the process. Equipment setup. We're going to be working with slow shutter speed, so a tripod is going to guarantee the best results. We're going to need a camera that has the flash options of rear or second curtain sync. We're going to need a compatible speed light. We want to use a remote shutter release. We don't want to press the shutter button on the camera and introduce camera shake. And a timer is just going to add another layer of complexity. It's just not really necessary. Probably the most important part of the equipment setup is the light box. You'll notice from the image that I have 4 ring lights that are going through a layer of diffusion that gives me a nice soft surrounding light. And that's important if you think back to our definition of color. The simple meaning was that it's just a light that's reflected back from the subject. So if we can surround the subject with a nice soft diffused light and optimize the reflected light, we can optimize the color. To complement that, the black backdrop will add a nice contrast to help bring out the color even more. The optional piece of the setup, which could easily be a do-it-yourself project, but I use a Wimberley clamp, and that just holds the subject in place so we can dial in our exposure. Camera settings. We want to turn off any autofocus setting that's assigned to the shutter button that tells the camera to confirm a lock before the shutter releases. Our subject's going to be moving, and autofocus locking will just delay the shutter, if it gets a lock at all, making it difficult to get consistent results. And we're going to set to focus in live view anyway. So if you're a back button shooter, you're already set. If you're not, and you're not quite sure what I'm talking about, make sure you write those settings down so you can roll them back after you're done practicing this technique. We want to use spot metering because we want to meter on the subject and not on the scene. We're going to set both the camera and the flash to manual mode. TTL flash won't work with this technique because, again, our subject is moving, and TTL will likely meter based on that black backdrop and overexpose. On the camera, the first thing we want to set is the ISO, and we want to set it to the maximum acceptable noise level. And that's going to vary from camera to camera and from person to person. And the reason we want to set it and forget it is because we're within macro range of our subject, and we're going to have a very shallow depth of field. The more we can squeeze out of the ISO, the more we can get out of the aperture for a wider depth of field. If you're not intimately familiar with your camera, an ISO of 1250 is a pretty happy number. I use it on my Nikon D850, and any denoiser can easily iron that out. The second thing we want to set is the shutter speed. I've experimented with falling leaves, shaking flowers, dropping flower petals. The happy medium there is 1/5 is a good starting place. And that's going to be the experimental speed that's going to control the effect of whether or not you want a longer color tail or a shorter color tail. And last but not least is the aperture. And that's just the last leg of the triangle. So after we set and forget our ISO, after we've dialed in the shutter speed for our desired result, we're just going to dial the aperture down until the exposure meter is zeroed out. And that's it. And now we're ready to go into the live portion of the video and start the experiment. Okay, so let's see this technique in action. The first thing we want to do is confirm our settings. So we'll go into info and confirm that in the lower left we are in rear curtain sync, we're in spot metering, and we're in AFS, single point autofocus mode. Now on the Nikon camera, if you're using spot metering with a single point autofocus, the camera will link the autofocus point with the metering mode. So wherever we put our focus point, that's going to tell us what our exposure is. Currently we're at 1/5 f/20 ISO 1250, and our meter is telling us that we are grossly overexposed. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take our aperture and close it down as far as it'll go. And I'm using a Nikon D850 camera with a Nikkor 105mm 2.8G. And it looks like it's going to let us close down to f/36. But the meter is telling us we're still about a stop and a third overexposed. And I know I said that in step number 2 in a previous video, we wanted to set the ISO to a maximum acceptable level. This bright yellow flower doesn't need that, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to drop the ISO down. But in a later video, we're going to look at a falling leaf and a feather. And the leaf is going to require that we bring the ISO up a little bit because it's not as bright as this yellow flower. So now we brought the ISO down to 500, and according to our meter, we have a proper exposure. So let's confirm again. Our focus is locked, and we're going to take a test shot. And we're going to go ahead and chimp that, and I'm in RGB highlights mode. If your camera has that, that'll give you zebra stripes or blinkies to let you know if any of the highlights are blown out. It doesn't look like it. It looks like we have a good exposure. Then we're going to go ahead and zoom in and look around and check our depth of field to make sure everything is sharp. And it is. So now we're going to go ahead and shake the flower. Now, in each of these techniques, we're going to try to stay on the focal plane. So when we shake the flower, we really don't want to go back and forth. We kind of want to stay side to side and stay in that focal plane. So I'm going to reach out. I'm going to shake my Wimberley clamp so the flower goes back and forth. And at some point, I'm just going to randomly press the shutter button and we'll see what happens. Okay, so there's our first shot, and you can see that we have a properly exposed flower, some nice color trails, and a really cool effect. Let's take a look at that again. Okay, so, and there you have it. Don't worry too much if your clamp is in the picture. We can crop that out later in post. But that's the technique. So I'm going to go ahead and get the leaf set up. And we're going to test out a leaf, and then later on we're going to test out a feather. Okay, so we looked at the flower, and we're going to go ahead and look at the leaf now. The first thing we want to do is expose for the brightest part of the leaf, because we don't want to blow out any highlights. Okay, and it looks like we are underexposed, and we're at 1/5 f36 is as small as we can go on the aperture, and the ISO is the only thing left. So we're going to go ahead and bring the ISO up. 1600 is a little high, but again, it all depends on your camera. So let's go ahead and make sure that we're on the brightest part of the leaf, and you can see when we changed our focus point that we're now a little bit overexposed. So we're going to bring it back down. We'll meet it in the middle at 1250. We're going to go ahead and take a test shot, same as always, and we're going to chimp that, and we don't have any blinkies, so our exposure is good. So now what we're going to do is get the Wimberley clamp out of the way. We're going to grab the leaf, we're going to hold it as high as we can inside the booth, we're going to let it go, and as soon as we let it go, we're going to press the shutter button. And here's a quick tip to get best results is we don't want to alter the time that we let go of the leaf with the shutter button. We're going to use the shutter speed as the catalyst in this experiment, because if we start changing more than one thing at a time, it's really going to be tough to get consistency. Okay, so we took a few test shots and we're going to take a look. And it looks like the shutter speed is a little too slow, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to speed that up a little bit. Move it up to F10, and we're going to have to check our exposure again to make sure we're not underexposed. So we'll put the leaf back in there. Focus on the brightest, and it looks like we're almost a third underexposed. So again, the only option we have is to bring our ISO up a little bit. So now we're at ISO 2500. Let's take a couple more test shots and see if that gives us better timing. And again, we're going to drop the leaf the same time we press the shutter button. The only thing we're going to change is the shutter speed. Okay, let's see what we have. Okay, so we got a pretty cool shot there. That one still seems a little bit fast. But again, it's going to be an experiment on, and of course it's going to be somewhat random on how fast the leaf falls. So the more shots you take, the cooler the effect, and the more likely you're going to have good shots. So it's just a matter of just keep dropping the leaf. It's going to spin, twirl. Sometimes it'll drop straight down. But it's a matter of just take a bunch of shots, experiment, and have some fun with it. Next, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to test the feather. So stay tuned. Okay, so now we have our feather. We're going to go ahead and confirm that we have a focus lock. And we're overexposed, so we're going to bring our ISO back down. Looks like that's about 1600. We're going to go ahead and take a test shot. Okay, even though that feather looks bright, we don't have any blinky, so we should be good there. Now, this is going to be the other end of the spectrum. I expect this feather to be a lot slower than the leaf, but we're going to go ahead and take a shot just to confirm. Okay, so let's take a look here. Yeah, so that's a little too fast. And you can see we barely have much of a trail there. So we're going to go the opposite direction with the shutter speed. Instead of 1/5, let's go down to 2.5. But we're going to have to set the exposure again and put our feather back on our clamp. Okay. So now we can get our ISO back down. And let's take a couple more shots. Okay, went a little crazy there. Took 4 or 5 shots, but all right. So that's looking a little better. Now, one thing with the feather and some of the other things that you drop off the top of the photo booth is it's going to leave the focal plane. And when it does that, it's going to affect our flash exposure. It's going to affect our camera exposure. So this is where the experiment gets fun. When we set our exposure, the intensity of the flash and our exposure from the camera is based on the focal plane that it's on. And when it leaves that focal plane, it's going to affect our exposure. So we don't, once we get it dialed in to where we hope and expect that the feather is going to fall, we want to leave it there. And all we're going to do at this point is we like the shutter speed, we like the aperture, we like the ISO. So we're just going to keep dropping the feather until we find some pretty cool shots and it's properly exposed. So let's take 4 or 5 more shots and see what happens. Okay, let's take a look here. That one is lost. That one curled around. That one's kind of cool. Well, my hand got in the way there. Okay, so that's probably the best one we got so far. And again, that shutter speed may be a little bit too slow. We may need to speed it up. And it's just a matter of refinement. So that's the technique we demonstrated with a feather, a leaf, and a flower. If you have any questions, just let me know. But have fun experimenting with this. Cheers. Okay, so the last phase in the life cycle is we're going to post-process these images. I went ahead and selected what I thought were the 3 best images that we were able to capture while we were experimenting with the technique. And I'm going to go ahead and open those up in Adobe Photoshop Elements. And one of the first things you'll notice is the images appear to be underexposed. And they are. And there's a reason for that. If you remember, we set our exposure for both the camera and the flash when these subjects were in the plamp and they were in a fixed location. Now, as the subjects move around, we shake the flower back and forth and drop the leaf and the feather. The lighting is going to change. It's going to be in a different place. It's going to enter and leave the focal plane. So the sharpness is going to be affected. The exposure is going to be affected. So the best recipe for success in this technique is to just take a lot of pictures and cherry pick the best ones with the best exposure, the best sharpness, and the coolest effects. So we're going to select all the images. We're going to select auto to see what the computer wants to do with these. That's fine. And again, you'll notice that this image, it wants to bring it up 2 stops of exposure, 1.5 and 2.4. And again, we're just going to go ahead and accept it and open the images up as a copy because we don't want to affect the raw image. And I'll show you a few of my favorite tools that I like to use when I post-process these. Okay, and just as an FYI, all of this debris here isn't sensor dust. It's actually debris that's on my backdrop. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do before we start cropping is Nick's collection has a great suite of tools, and one of my favorites is perspective effects. And what this does is every lens has a little bit of distortion. And even though there aren't any straight lines or corners here, by correcting the distortion in software, it kind of brings back a little bit of clarity and sharpness to it. So before I do any cropping, I run the perspective effects. And now we're ready to crop. After I crop, another one of my favorite tools is a software by a company called Anthropics, and it's called Smart Photo Editor. And this is a cheap tool. I think you can pick it up for 15 bucks. Sometimes they have it on sale for 5 bucks. And it has a lot of cool presets. One of my favorites for flowers is lighting contrast. And you can see what happens, and that's why I didn't use the healing brush to get rid of these spots. Because as we add this lighting contrast effect, it's going to darken the background, brighten this up a little bit, and it just makes it look silky smooth. So once we do that, I am going to grab my healing brush, zoom in a little bit, and kind of pick out these really big distractions. Clean the image up a bit. And the last tool that I use on every image, whether I need to or not, is Topaz Labs has a denoise AI. And I have experimented with all of the denoisers out there. And in my opinion, this is the best. So you basically select auto again here, and you can see it looks at the image and doesn't find that much noise. But it does want to sharpen it up a bit. So with this technique, if you work with darker subjects, maybe darker leaves or Something else where you really need to bring your ISO up to keep that aperture with a wide depth of field. Topaz Denoise AI does a really, really good job on recovering that noise and ironing it out. Albeit it's not the fastest software out there, but it does a really good job. Okay, so there's one image. I think it looks pretty good. We only took about 4 or 5 shots of this one. Let's move on to the second one. And again, the wider you can shoot, we can always crop it in later. Get rid of these distractions here. This is our clamp. So we'll get rid of the distortion. And again, you can see we have some blown out highlights here. And that's because it left the focal plane and came forward, and the flash overexposed it. So let's go ahead and crop it. That looks fine. Go into Smart Photo Editor. And again, don't try any cleanup with a smart or with a healing brush until you adjust the contrast. And again, we only took a few shots of the leaf. More shots you take, the better it's going to get. And I'm going to hold off on the Topaz Denoise on this because it's so laggy. Okay, and the last is the feather. So we're going to get rid of the distortion. Crop it a little bit. Add our lighting contrast. And grab our healing brush. Get rid of some of these particles here, some of the big ones. And again, I'm going to hold off on the denoising, but that would be usually my final step. And that's it. And that's how I get these images. So I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. And again, if you have any questions, go ahead and ask below and I'll do my best to answer. Thank you.